Welcome as we come now to the 33rd week of the year, the second last of this A season, which of course our guide, as we know as a gospel, is that of Matthew, and this time it will be chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. The other two readings, the first from the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 10 through 13, 19 through 20, 30 through 31. You'll see a little bit later there's a bit of editing goes on with regard to this particular reading. And then the chapter from Thessalonians 5, and it will be verses 1 through 6. All right. We have been looking at the concluding parables in the Matthean tradition. This time we come to, the second, but really it's the third of four. But the one last time, remember, of the virgins or maidens being prepared for the coming of the bridegroom, has that sense of being prepared. This week, the parable is that of the talents. Now, this particular parable is also found, and we looked at it last year, in the tradition of Luke, but the way in which Luke uses it and the way in which Matthew uses it are rather different. First of all, to point out that this parable in Matthew is perhaps the longest, the lengthiest, I was going to say, and it is what we call a Parousia parable as Matthew interprets it. Remember, Parousia is let's be looking forward to the coming, but as always is kind of the emphasis on parables or the message, the attention should be given not simply to the future, but also to the present. So although this parable is similar to that of Luke, it takes on some very different directions and very different purposes. How does it work? Well, the parable, you remember, is that there is a man who is going on a journey, and he calls in three of his servants. Servant's a nice word. Slave, perhaps, is a better, as we've noticed on a number of occasions, term here. Servants has one way of understanding things. Slave, perhaps, as another. In this account, now we're looking at the way in which Matthew does it, but I could back up and say, how does Luke do it? He gives some money to three persons. Now, in Luke, he gives the same amount to all three. In Matthew, he gives 5 to one, 3 to another, and 1 to a third. So the amount, and now I'm going to suggest as we look at it today that there are perhaps two major ways of interpreting this particular parable. One of them deals with an understanding of the background of the time. The other has, because it is this eschatological viewpoint, a much different interpretation. Now, I'm not sure which one to start with, but we are going to start with the practical approach. He gives a certain amount of money to, as I mentioned, each of these three. Now, we have noticed before, but it's important perhaps to reiterate again in our discussions today, that first of all, this is money, and although they're called talents, and that's where another interpretation comes in, a talent could be a certain ability. That's not what is intended here. We're talking about down-to-earth, real money. Now, in the first century world, and we've noticed this, and I mention it again, people believed that all the goods had already that existed had already been distributed. So unlike in our time where you can earn more, you can build up a greater amount, not so in the Mediterranean and first century thinking world. So if there wasn't any extra to go around that somehow you kind of picked up on the way. So this wealthy man, so you really would have to say that he's in a good position, could be considered, as this parable is interpreted from this point of view, as being rather greedy. What he wants to do is make more money, to get more money. And so he gives these talents to 5, and this guy produces 5 more. 3, he produces 3 more, and of course the guy who gets 1 takes his talent or his money and buries it, puts it in the ground, which, by the way, would have been the normal way to hide money for most people at that time. Although it says he could have put it in a bank to earn interest, banking is kind of a Western way of thinking or European way of thinking, which would not have been the way of thinking of a first century world. All right, so wealthy people, and this is one way to interpret this, well, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and that certainly could be one way to interpret this. Because if the man and the slave who is working for the master, after all, does he have much choice is one way of interpreting this. After all, slaves did not simply serve their rich master, but they perhaps tried to imitate him. So is that what this guy is doing? By making 5 more, he's imitating the master. But how is this working? As I've used this model before, and I use it again, assume that all the money in the world, all the wealth in the world could be found in $1. Now I know that's a really ridiculous small amount, but think of it that way. And then of that $1, the wealth was distributed. Say 10 coins here, 10 coins here, 20 coins here, 30 coins here, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, to make it up to the 100. All right, so if somebody, and in this case, makes 5 more, the guy who has received 5 makes 5 more, well, where does that 5 more come from, if not from the existing money that some others have already had? And very often the way in which that would take place would be from the poor. Yeah, obviously, someone who had 20, well, would that be taken from that person or that group? Probably not. But where would it go? Well, maybe to the one who had 1, nothing. Another one with 1, taken away, nothing. What have you done? You have reduced the ones who had something, not a lot, to greater poverty. Notice the adage, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Is that one way to interpret this particular parable? Now, we're not quite sure what the value of a talent was, by the way. It is a Greek word. It's a measure of weight. So how much does it weigh? Varying, so we are told, from 58 to 80 pounds. So depending on just exactly who was loading it up and how it was going to work. Anyway, it is a unit of currency, therefore that varied from time to time. But however you kind of wheeled and dealed it, it was a very large sum of money. All right, so that again, a little review about the value of the talent. We're talking here about real kinds of things. The slaves are commissioned to handle their affairs, that is, whose affairs? The affairs of the rich man who goes on a journey. And everyone knew slaves were, and this is important, shameless and unhonorable in their behavior, and what more could you expect from them than they would try to do whatever the master wanted them to do. So that's the background part of it here. The two of the three do exactly what dishonorable slaves would do for their owner or their master, make more money for him. So is this a question about greed, about getting more wealth, about putting others at a disadvantage? Now, from that point of view, come to the third. The third slave buries the money, decides, we think, not to play the game. And when the master returns, he rewards appropriately the one who has made, the two have made more money for him, or more money for him. But now he comes to the third, who now makes up excuses. Well, he seems to say, now whether this is an excuse or whether this is the reality, and here, of course, is a difference of viewpoint. If it's a reality, what he says is, I know that you are a hard master, a taskmaster, that you take what you did not earn, etc., etc. So he does it out of courage. He says, you're this kind of man, and I am not going to play that game. I know, and the owner guy admits it. He says, well, you knew I was that kind of a person. Why didn't you play the game? But he didn't. The reason is not given. But and because of that, he loses the money he has, and really finds himself, if you want, in the same lot as the very poor. Now, does he act this way because he's afraid of the master? Is that why he kind of makes up all these excuses? Or, as I mentioned, were the excuses not excuses, but were the reality? From this point of view, therefore, we could say that this third guy who refuses to make more money for the master, but he is not going to take the master's money. He gives it back to him. He's not a thief, but he might be considered here as being rather courageous, standing on the side of the poor, standing on the side of those who would say, enough is enough, we're not going to play that game anymore, whatever it is, and it will come at a cost to the person who takes this stance. So from that viewpoint, it is not that the third guy acts out of temerity, out of fear, but he acts out of a sense of, from this point of view, justice. I will not take advantage of others, particularly of those who are perhaps in the same category financially as I am. I will not do that. I will not take that stance. I stand instead against what you are doing. I stand against greed. I stand for the sake of justice. And in that sense, from this point of view, interpreting the parable, the third guy is really the hero. Now, often as we will shift this a little bit, we'll notice that's not the way in which it's understood. He's understood, the third guy, as being fearful, not doing his task, of being afraid, hiding, all of that kind of thing. The other are using their ability and indeed producing more. But you see, if you kind of put together what we've been suggesting here, all they are doing is helping the system continue. They are enabling the wealthy man to get wealthier, and in a certain way are putting themselves also in a position now, because they have handled wealth well, I give you charge of more. So they are advancing, again, as it were, from this point of view, taking advantage of the others, of their fellow workers and slaves. So, in that sense, you can interpret this particular parable a little differently than often it is given or taken, because we think of this third guy as just kind of being lazy, not doing anything, just waiting around to see when the master would return. But from the point of view that I've suggested, he really is to be admired for what he does. Is there a cost for taking a stance like this? Yes. Is there a cost, some would reinterpret it today, say, for taking a stance for justice against those who exploit the poor and take advantage of systems that make them wealthier? Is there a cost that one might expect for taking that kind of stance? Well, you figure it out, but often there is. Now, there's another point of view, however, and let's look at this one now, which sees things a little differently, which sees the owner. We're not going to talk, in some way, we're not going to worry about the money, but sees the owner as recognizing three of his servants as having talents, has certain abilities, and he gives one 5, another 3, the other 1, and they are gifts. See, from this point of view, he is giving them money. They are not going to have to return it. See, so now when we begin to see this, it's a gift. Whatever they do with it is up to them. It's theirs. All right. However, he recognizes that there's a difference in ability, and he'd like to see how they will use the gifts that they have. So the master here has made a shrewd appraisal of the personal capacity of each, and he entrusts different sums to each of them based on what he perceives is their ability to do things. So see the difference of approach here, that the master really is analyzing, if you want, his servants or his slaves, and from that point of view, why he gives more to one than to another. The first two, therefore, kind of pay off the perspective that the owner has, that they are wise and will use their gifts, and they do, and thus they earn a reward. Now we come to the third slave, who has done nothing to increase the sum entrusted to him. Now, is it fear of the master that he then begins to make up excuses? Now, as going back to the first one, we could say, was it true, or does he now, because he is fearful, make up excuses why he could not and why he did not carry out his task? The answer was he could have got simple interest. Well, for even that he didn't do, and so he will not be rewarded. So from this point of view, then the third guy really does mess up. He doesn't use the gift he has had. He buries it, buries his gift, buries his talent. Is that perhaps the message that might be taken from this point of view? So some, though through fear, may think that they can get by simply avoiding wrongdoing and giving back to God what they have received on the basis of strict justice. So notice where we're going here, that therefore this image of the owner appropriately can see the owner as being God-given talents, abilities to different people, and hopes that they use them. Notice in the first interpretation, you need to be careful here that the master is not God. God is not greedy. God is not looking to make more, to make the poor poorer, etc. So these are two really interestingly, if you think of it, different interpretations of this particular parable. And the one that I just mentioned is perhaps the one that is more familiar up until recent times, but it depends on how you want to look at what the cultural, social background of the times happened to be. So because now looking at this particular interpretation, they have used the gifts that they have. Then the phrase that the master says, enter now into the joy of your master. Because you have certainly done kind of good things. And I will say that this particular interpretation might lead to the final parable that we will look at next week in terms of how we share the gifts of mercy, forgiveness, etc., with others. So, which of these two interpretations do you like? The one that says here, it's a warning to the rich to stop exploiting the poor, and is one that encourages poor people to take a measure that expose such greed for the sin that it is. So that, of course, is a rather sobering, realistic note of what can happen, of course, to those who oppose the rich and the powerful. So that's the first interpretation of the parable that could be taken. The other is, well, more gracious. Use the gifts that you have. Don't lose them because you don't use them. Again, you remember that kind of phrase comes into play. So I think that this parable of the talents, particularly now from the viewpoint of Matthew, has some interesting takes to it. If you don't like talents to be money, well, then you don't like that first interpretation. If you do see that talents are what the Greek term was and is, and the sense that it was a monetary amount, well, then you have to go with the first interpretation. So all of that is kind of have fun with interpreting this parable and see how the interpretation is going to be given in the homilies that you hear this weekend, which of these two directions will be taken. A word now about the first reading, which comes from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, of course, was a collection of sayings. We all know what a proverb is. They're kind of often one-liners that are characterized by the truth. So a stitch, I always use this one, although I'm not sure those who are watching might be familiar with this. A stitch in time saves 9. Well, what does that mean? If you have a rip or a hole, if you see that and immediately go to kind of stitch it up, you won't have to worry about it getting bigger. But if you just, oh, well, it's just a little rip, we'll fix it later. And if you watch, it gets bigger and bigger. Thus, a stitch in time says 9. A penny earned is a penny saved. Well, there's a truth there, right? So we know what Proverbs are. But chapter 31 of the book of Proverbs stands as a entry to this work that almost could be read or interpreted on its own. Now, Proverbs often have what we would call allegorical descriptions, and in this sense, by the way, wisdom, which is what everyone is trying to achieve, is, as we've noticed in other situations, often personified as a she, namely a her. With that in mind, this particular chapter is known as the ideal wife. Now, have to, again, keep in mind the cultural background at the time in which this particular understanding is developed. We're living in a patriarchal world, they were living in a patriarchal world, but it isn't that women didn't have a certain voice in things, but in terms, at least publicly, it was often the male that was the one that was noticed. Now, the ideal wife. And I have to point out, as we started here, that this has been carefully edited. Certain verses have been left out. So if you want to get the whole kind of drift of this, you need to read the whole chapter 31. All right, so just in passing. Now, the ideal wife is treasured more than the reality. So keep in mind that there's a difference between the ideal and the reality. We all have that, right? This would be the ideal circumstance. The reality sometimes doesn't always match the ideal. So that's not important for thinkers here. It's important that the ideal is kept in mind. All right. The women were expected to engage in planned and calculated activities as described in the select sections that we hear. She is to make life workable for husband, for family, and even for community. Now, knowing that the master was, and I go back to the gospel today, knowing that the master was greedy, nevertheless calculated the cost to him, did the honest thing with the entrusted money. He preserved it and didn't risk. Okay, so that's the point I wanted to make sure that we leave with today before we go on too much further. The description of this woman is, again, from a male point of view, highlighting characteristics men would find pleasing, and betrays, as I mentioned, a cultural point of view. In patriarchal societies, a man is judged primarily by his ability to manage his own household. The woman is to act in a self-sufficient manner. Now, to say that the woman, that to the woman he has entrusted his heart, this is the point that we might notice in this reading, is to say that she is privy to his inner reflections and is thus competent, even without his guidance, to assume responsibilities that are really his. So keep in mind that the heart was considered, of course, to be the center of the human being. We noticed this on a number of occasions, that it is the center of thinking, feeling, and all of the qualities that truly make us human. The woman is pictured here as, and this is the key line that perhaps we ought to notice, she is the one who fears the Lord. Now, this is the way in which this chapter begins, and it's also the way in which the chapter ends. Now, fear of the Lord, and we have mentioned this before, fear of the Lord does not mean being afraid of God, okay? Being afraid of the Lord, fear of the Lord. No, fear of the Lord might be better translated at times as awe, an awe in the presence of God, an awesomeness about the wonder of God. And this, of course, is the basis of wisdom. Wisdom recognizes that the Creator has placed into the world and into all beings a sense of wonder, a sense of greatness, a sense of goodness. And the wise person, hence why wisdom is so important, recognizes that and seeks to share that and let that flow, if you want, out into the activities of every life, of everyday life. So the good wife, the good woman, makes all things livable for everyone. And she gives to others the fruits of her hand. What God has created, she is aware of, grateful for, and now extends it in a kind way to others. Well, So keep in mind, the men have said this, but that's not a bad way to think of all people having the wisdom of recognizing the greatness of God, the fear of the Lord. As the kids would say, used to say, I think, it's awesome. And that might be the way to understand fear of the Lord here this day. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you soon.